Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for submitting your questions. I just thought that doing it via video versus trying to type all this stuff out gives me an opportunity to be a little more thorough on some of these answers because I know with history and of course, 50 years has gone by since the Carpenters were originally signed. And so we get interviews on from Richard and or Herb or whomever over many interviews over many years over several decades, and sometimes answers changed and it gets confusing, and so this will help to hopefully sort of hone that in and get it all into one cohesive response. So what I thought I would do is I would take a couple questions at a time and create these little video blurbs, and so as to not get too lengthy and too wordy. So I'll jump in. I'm just going to grab a couple at random. The first question was submitted by Geographer. Thank you, by the way. It says a perceived contradiction in recollection and stories. It says Herb Alpert has stated in the past that upon hearing Karen's voice on the demo tape, it sounded as if she was sitting in his lap. However, we learned that Herb is also said to have been surprised that Karen even sang, asking her, "You sing too?" Upon hearing some finished recordings from Offering. So which is it? Okay, so first off, I want to preface this by saying that, and we see this a lot of times in old interviews, former interviews with Richard, where you can hear an interviewer asking a question and then asking a different interviewer maybe 5 years later or 10 years later or 30 years later asking the same question, and it's almost like you get a different answer. It's much like the Bible, where people say, "Oh, the Bible contradicts itself." Actually, it doesn't. If you read it from front to back, Scripture interprets Scripture, and there is a cohesiveness, but you've got to have all the pieces in order to put the links together. And sometimes it's just a matter of asking somebody. You have two people that give an account of something, and one person says, "So, well, that happened at night, such and such," and then another person says, "Such and such happened in the late afternoon." Well, they're both technically correct. Nobody's being disingenuous. They just have a different perception of something, and so we're dealing with a lot of that here. And of course, you've got 50 years behind it. So the reason that the Offering demo confusion keeps coming up with Herb's answer is because you have to remember that three of the four masters that were recorded, the actual native file, the masters for the demo that went to Herb and Jerry, that went to A&M and got them their deal, were the same master tapes that were utilized and mixed, maybe added to, but essentially used for the Offering album. And of course, Herb was aware of that, and so that connection has been in the back of his mind throughout history. So we know that Your Wonderful Parade, I believe, was the first thing that he heard. And of course, Richard sings the lead on that. But of course, he listened to the entire demo. He listened to it multiple times and was well aware of Karen by the time that they actually were in working on the Offering album. Karen and Richard had a self-imposed anxiety, I guess, if you will, about getting that album done quickly. And so that was the reason that they didn't bother fully re-recording everything, was because they thought that they needed to get it done. And a lot of that was their excitement. And so I think they had the album finished by the summer of '69. But we know that Your Wonderful Parade, it's the same master that was recorded for the demo, was used for the Offering album with the exception of Richard's lead. The strings were replaced with real strings because he was using... I think he was using the Chamberlain Music Master keyboard string instrument or string track or whatever, and then it was VSO'd. So it was variable speed oscillation, which you could take the tape machine and you could speed it up or slow it down. The original track was recorded a little slow and draggy, so it was sped up a semitone, I believe. And actually, if you listen, just a little piece of trivia, and most of you probably already know this, if you listen to the demo of Your Wonderful Parade, Karen counts it in 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and then brum 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 brum. On the Offering album, of course, Richard has the entire spoken intro that was recorded. When he gets to the bit, don't forget to take your place in line, leave your minds behind or mind behind, and join the procession of the people by the people. And then if you listen right about there, underneath, you can hear Karen's count in 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. It's the same. It's the same track. It's the same deal. That outtake was left in there. All I can do was recorded the version that we hear on Offering was the demo version. It was just the electric piano, the drums, and all of their vocals. Joe's not even playing bass on that one. They didn't do anything with that other than they remixed it into stereo from the 4-track. Invocation was another one that was recorded in '68 for the demo that Herb and Jerry heard, and it was just given a remix for Offering. So Don't Be Afraid is the only one that got a complete redo, a do-over in terms of recording and remix. So that's where that gets confused. A lot of times Herb's saying the same thing, the Offering, essentially he was already hearing what was going to be on Offering when he heard the demo. It's these answers, and a lot of times they answer very confidently because he's enjoying the interview. He doesn't, he's either forgetting certain things or, he's speaking in such a way that he remembers something confidently, but he's sort of mixing up the details. Richard will do that too, and that's just human. I mean, it's been 50 years, and they get this stuff mixed up sometimes. So that's what was going on there. The second question, and I hope I answered your question, and if I didn't, feel free to chime in, and I can get more specific if need be. Second question, submitted by Tom Swift, 2002. Thank you. Is why does Buonascino Home play in stereo on the original vinyl and 45s, but it's in mono on all the digital releases? It's actually the same mix. Part of what was going on, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more here than I probably need to, but in the discography in our book, The Carpenters, The Musical Legacy, in the Buonascino Home entry in particular, I addressed the hearing loss that was being suffered by engineer Ray Gerhardt. You actually start hearing this as early as '74 with the tracks on Please Mr. Postman. You hear it on Love Me For What I Am, which I believe the track was cut in late '74. I'll have to look at the contracts on that. And then Sailing on the Tide, which actually ended up on Voice of the Heart in '83. Those tracks were first recorded in '74 and then again in '75. So that has a whole history in and of itself. And again, you're hearing the same thing. Much of what was going on to compensate for his hearing loss was a lot of stuff was sounding very stuffy and mid-rangey and very, a lot of the high end was missing as he was bringing things into the board. I mean, this is how he was recording and miking certain things. So that paired with the issue with a lot of the tracks actually on Passage was a lot of that stuff, a lot of those rhythm tracks especially were recorded live, and even some of the brass with there was a lot going on in Studio D to record this, and so you had a lot of track sharing. I think I've addressed this in another thread elsewhere here on the forum, but so, if you start stacking multiple instruments on one track on a 24-track master, you're locking things together that if you try to place them in stereo when you go to mix it, you're taking all of that instrumentation doing the same. So it starts to you become very limited unless you're strategic as an engineer, recording engineer, about what you're putting on which tracks, as to how far you can go in the stereo field without throwing the whole mix out of balance. If that makes any sense, I don't know if I'm getting too insider, but so to finally answer your question, Buono was mixed in stereo, but the stereo wasn't wide for the most part. I mean, other than I think you have one of the backing vocal overdub tracks I think got pushed over a little bit. The majority of it sounded a bit monaural to begin with. I mean, granted, if you're being the original mix from Passage versus a reissue on, let's say, the remastered classics from '98 on CD, remember, when they pull those 2-channel masters later on to place them, I'm talking about the original mixes on these later digital reissues, you've got fidelity loss. A lot of those masters have had to be baked because of the oxidation. And then, of course, with the updated technology and mastering, now you're using digital mastering. In some cases, nowadays there's still analog mastering facilities, and Grunman, I think, was still doing a lot of that when when we, back in '98, of course, most all of that was all going to be through analog anyway. But again, you've got fidelity loss. So you take a song that really wasn't mixed that wide to begin with, and then, through the years and with fidelity loss on those tapes, it gets more and more narrow. And then, of course, if you reissue it on a vinyl that isn't pressed or replicated properly, then now you have another issue. So I hope that answers your questions. There really isn't any difference there, other than, again, it's just what tape they sourced and at what time in the timeline and what process that tape had to go through in order to get it ready to place on the digital format, whatever that may be, whether that was for download or that was something straight to CD, Red Book. You're gonna have some issues there, especially because it really wasn't mixed that wide as far as the stereo is concerned to begin with. So I hope I've addressed some of your questions. And again, feel free, write responses if you have any other questions to any of this stuff, or I've confused anything, I'm happy to clarify. All right, thanks so much, guys, and I'll be back with more later.